and perhaps we've forgotten what we are capable of as human beings. We've forgotten the atrocities that we're capable of if there are no rules at all. And so it is really pushing on those states to understand that it's not just them that are at stake and their allyship. It's our collective harmony and balance as a people that is at stake.
Around the world, human rights are under assault. The rise of autocratic leaders and conservative and reactionary movements have sought to reverse many of the gains that girls, women, and LGBTIQ communities have made in recent decades. Social critics and political dissidents suffer from harassment, intimidation, and arrest for exercising their freedom of speech and assembly, while journalists are increasingly targeted for simply reporting the news. Migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers face growing restrictions as exclusionary national movements rise, and there's a growing sense in many richer democracies that our labor markets and public services cannot manage the influx of newcomers. Yet the forces driving the latter to leave their homes, from violent conflict to economic precarity to environmental catastrophes, seem to grow, from government repression and persistent wars to the acceleration of climate change. Charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide have become prominent. Yet powerful states have attacked the purview of international law and the regimes established to protect it, from the International Criminal Court to the International Court of Justice. Threats to national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and civic safety have led many governments to boost military spending. Yet the focus on hard power and physical security has often gone in tandem with cuts to international development assistance, undermining soft power and a broader conception of human security, let alone dignity. So how do we safeguard human rights when the very systems designed to protect them are under assault? What strategies can citizens, advocates, and governments employ when traditional diplomatic channels are strained by great power rivalry? How can grassroots movements maintain momentum amid repression while building international solidarity across increasingly divided nations? And what role can civil society play in bridging gaps that governments cannot or will not address? This lecture series, as Sergio mentioned, is called On the Front Lines of Democracy. And the word front lines in the title has several meanings. But our guest this evening has literally been on the front lines of human rights activism for many years. Ketty Nivyabandi serves as the Secretary General for Amnesty International Canada's English-speaking section. A student of international relations and a former journalist, and also a published poet, I learned, Ms. Nivyabandi is a global human rights advocate with in-depth expertise and lived experience across a range of issues, from forced displacement to protecting human rights defenders, to civic action in countries undergoing regime change, to understanding the global intersections of race, gender, and human rights violations. Prior to seeking asylum in Canada in 2015, she braved police violence as the lead organizer of women's protests advocating peaceful democratic change in her home country, Burundi. In her previous roles at the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Women's Movement for Peace and Security, and the US State Department, Ketty led research, advocacy, and communication strategies while conducting activist campaigns in several countries, including Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Myanmar, Guatemala, and even Uganda. Her work is committed to a feminist decolonial approach to human rights that enhances popular power and public accountability. Ketty will speak for half an hour. I'll then start a conversation with her to explore some of the issues raised by her talk before we open it up to your questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Ketty Nivyabandi.
I'm impressed to have a full room, and if you have braved what I have heard about the Toronto traffic, and you've made it to a public library on a Thursday evening in November to listen to a talk on the prospects of human rights, then I suspect you already know a great deal about what I'm going to talk about tonight. I also suspect that in recent months and weeks, you have often felt agitated, overwhelmed, angry, worried about our future, as much as I am. So let us agree from the start that this is not a lecture, but instead a space for us to think and to feel together, a gathering of kin held by a common concern for our present and our future. And that, in itself, is already a powerful form of resistance. The most powerful one, perhaps. It goes without saying, and Sanjay alluded to it in his introduction, that we are living in extraordinary and historical times. We're witnessing a transformation of the world, one that many, especially just south of the border, are feeling in their bones. There are many factors that are endangering life on our planet. Where do we begin? The live-streamed genocide in Gaza, Russia's illegal aggression on Ukraine, which rages on, the devastating conflict in Sudan, which has displaced over 1 million people and yet fails to make international headlines, the utter loss of agency and the gender apartheid of women in Afghanistan who are no longer allowed to have the sound of their voice heard in public, or the blazing temperatures driven by the fossil fuel industry, which are displacing and destroying indigenous and coastal communities worldwide, or the more invisible crises closer to us, which plague communities beyond the public eye, like that of Louise Delisle, an 80-year-old descendant of Black loyalists who I met just a week or so ago, and who still does not have access to safe drinking water in Canada. Louise has spent her life fighting for justice for her community in Sherburne in Nova Scotia, where a landfill filled with industrial, medical, and other types of wastes from the municipality has polluted her exclusively Black neighborhood for decades. But as much as we're living in tectonic times, we must resist the temptation to think that things were ever once great anywhere, and that they must be made great again. For most people around the world, and for Indigenous and Black peoples in Canada, the world has ended multiple times, and norms have failed them over and over and over again. I do, however, think that there are new and unique factors to our times that have thrust us at this critical juncture. First, Sanjay spoke to it, is a change of era, what many are calling the end of the post-World War II liberal or illiberal, depending on where you situate yourself, international order. And with it, an unabashed disregard and even active sabotage of the 1948 human rights framework. By human rights framework, I mean the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the system built from the devastation and the ashes of 1945. The Second World War, the destructive power of the atomic bomb, and of course, the Holocaust. Out of these horrors sprang a new moral spine for the world, cast in the lessons of humanity's darkest chapter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. An aspirational code of values, drafted, debated, advocated by individuals of goodwill who understood the gravity of their time, who grasped the opportunity in their hands, and who dared to dream and imagine a world of dignity for all. Most of them are well known. Eleanor Roosevelt is commonly referred to, of course, but there were many others. Hansa Mehta from India, whom we have to thank for changing Article 1 of the Declaration from all men are born equal in dignity and rights to all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. Article 8 on securing women's equality was born from the vigorous advocacy of Latin American delegates like the feminist activist Dr. Berta Lutz and Minerva Bernardino from Brazil and the Dominican Republic. Many more women from the rest of the world shaped the document and ensured it carried the aspirations of all peoples. Among the 3,000 delegates who gathered in San Francisco in the spring of 1945 to create the United Nations was Mary McLeod Bethune, the only African-American woman attending in an official capacity. Born from formerly enslaved parents and known as the First Lady of Struggle, a passionate activist and supremely eloquent advocate, Mary was the official representative of the NAACP, the only organization granted official status at the conference. She worked with Walter White and W.E.B. Du Bois to ensure that the perspectives of African Americans informed the US delegation. And so they met and they collaborated with other delegations from Asia and South America to shape the new UN Charter and what would later become the International Bill of Rights. So the Declaration of 1948 was the fruit of a bold and emancipatory imagination that stretched across the world. Although it later came to be seen as and driven as a Western project, at its birth, it carried the voices of both the powerful and the oppressed. And for many, like Mary, it became a powerful tool to advance their domestic cause. It was also a historical compromise during a sharply divided time between the Western and the Eastern Bloc. The West pushed for civil and political rights, while freedom of religion, freedom from torture, equality before the law, while the Eastern Bloc, with colonized states, were pushing for self-determination, economic, social and cultural rights. This divide in viewpoints only deepened later and created two covenants, one on civil and political rights, and the other on economic and social and political rights. But in practice, this created two perspectives, two interpretations, which later betrayed the spirit of the Declaration. Western states ratified, but quietly ignored, economic, social, and political rights, while the former Eastern Bloc disregarded and violated civil and political rights. In other words, the seeds of the crumble we are witnessing today were already sown then. For now, I'll come back to that later. For now, I want you to keep in mind the names of Mary McLeod Bethune and Ansa Mehta, who were the forebearers of this expansive vision of justice and dignity for all peoples everywhere. In her brilliant book, Practical Audacity, Black Women and International Human Rights, Stanley James brings to light the stories of 14 extraordinary women who have shaped the very system under attack today. They were brilliant, visionary, courageous, and astute, and rooted in the well-being of their people. It is important to resurface this history, because much of the contemporary critique of human rights has been that either they have not been efficient or that they are a construct of the West and the liberal order, which I would argue is an association fallacy, or throwing the baby with the bathwater, an expression I hate as a mother, but I digress. Both the Western and Eastern Bloc betrayed the vision of Eleanor, Mary, and thousands by choosing to only focus on one set of rights and applying them selectively. This started during the Cold War, became more evident after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the United States championed civil and political rights around the world. And then, of course, came September 11, which marked a new turning point, as the war on terror became an excuse to evade accountability and to override international human rights law. Of course, countless states, including Russia, China, and those on the UN Security Council, had done the same. The difference, perhaps, was that because the United States had been such a staunch champion, these double standards only became more flagrant. This entrenched impunity and in turn gave a new excuse for states perpetrating atrocities to ignore international law. Not that they were ever abiding by it, but now the semblance of a world of rules continued to crack, giving way to much of what we see today. In my own work and posture on human rights, I situate myself with these extraordinary women who dared to imagine not just a world, but moral, legal, and political tools to protect the dignity of all human beings. These tools later enabled independence leaders across the African continent, including my own uncle, to demand and push for independence, thus ending years of human rights violations endured by formerly colonized people around the world. Much later, this informed the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, which Indigenous leaders used right here in Canada to assert their treaty rights. It is this very foundation that is at stake today. The Declaration itself, the Genocide Convention, the Vienna Convention on Refugees and Asylum Seekers, the many international covenants and treaties which in turn were ratified by countries around the world, and the multilateral tools created to enforce them are all being increasingly disregarded, if not discarded. Which brings me to the second significant challenge of our time. So in addition to reshaping the international order, we're also in the middle of a global authoritarian renaissance. A new breed of emboldened men has emerged whose appetite for power simply knows no bound. From Viktor Orban in Hungary, Putin in Russia, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, previously Bolsonaro in Brazil, now Milei in Argentina, or even El Salvador's Bukele, and of course, the one who wanted to annex Canada. I'm trying hard not to say his name. Their personal style may vary, but with them come coordinated, well-funded nationalist campaigns promoting patriarchal, nationalistic, and anti-rights ideologies, often targeting racial and religious minorities and removing all state checks and balances. These practices are rising and spreading at a rate and a scale that demands our full attention. Unlike the coups d'etats of the 80s, these guys are elected into office. They are brash and unleashed. They manipulate the fears, the needs, and the desires of the population, often promising simple and mistaken solutions for complex problems. Interestingly, they rely on people's frustrations with their socioeconomic rights, food, housing, a decent standard of living, to in turn promise civil and political rights. I will give you back your freedoms, and I will make you and your country great again. This, of course, is a farce, since once in office, they work to dismantle the free press, the right to protest, the right to a fair trial, the right to asylum, and so on and so forth. Among the multiple tools in the authoritarian playbook is autocratic legalism, an arsenal of laws to constrain and weaken the checks and balances, and therefore accountability. Civil society and human rights movements are especially at risk. Viktor Orban's government in Hungary has been a laboratory for authoritarian practices for the past 15 years, and he is the designer-in-chief of anti-civil society laws, which have now spread to Paraguay, Venezuela, El Salvador, Peru, my home country, Burundi, and to some extent the USA. Last November, the US House of Representatives passed a bill which would grant the Secretary of the US Department of the Treasury unilateral authority to remove the tax-exempt status of any US nonprofit group that it designates a terrorist-supporting organization. The problem, of course, is that the legislation does not define the term, and the bill does not require the government to provide any evidence to support such a decision. And so the purpose of these practices is to create a chilling effect, even among civil liberties organizations, who now have to carefully toe the line or risk losing their status. So these two existential threats, the fragility of international human rights on one hand and the global rise of authoritarian practices on the other, are both accelerated by a third factor, the techno-oligarchy, And by that, I mean the capture of technology, the tool that most of us depend on daily, unless you have managed to escape the matrix, and if so, tell us how. But we depend on these to work, to connect with our loved ones, to find information, to entertain ourselves, to stay informed. While technology, in particular social media and artificial intelligence, have brought us closer and made our lives easier, even made the fight against autocrats easier, their capture by a handful, and literally a handful, of tech giants with terrifying disregard for human rights makes us more vulnerable than ever before. So, my friends, we, all of us, are in trouble. The old world is dying, and a new world struggles to be born. Now is a time of monsters. These famous words are, of course, from the philosopher Antonio Gramsci. He wrote them in the 1930s in Italy while imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime. In his prison notes, he used the word interregnum to describe the strange and obscure period between the death of one sovereign and the enthronement of the next, and in between, a time of uncertainty, instability, where all we know feels fragile and at stake, a time where authority is suspended. It's a quote that resonates strikingly today, where every morning seems to usher us deeper into a new world, one we have not chosen nor designed, a new form of imperialist, racist, patriarchal, oligarch project at complete odds with the spirit and the vision of the 1948 dream. Yes, we may be in the interregnum, but Gramsci also had some equally apt words that I'd like to lean on tonight. I am a pessimist because of intelligence and an optimist because of will. Progress on human rights has always required perseverance, endurance, a certain almost irrational stubbornness in the face of horror, a conviction that another way is possible. So what do we do? How do we, as a society, respond? Note that I say as a society and not just as civil society or grassroots movements. In normal times, civil society acts as the watchdog of the powerful. But these, of course, are not usual times, and the powerful are no longer afraid of being watched. In fact, they deliberately bend the rules and they weaken the guardrails of society in broad daylight. Across the world, my valiant colleagues are burning out. They're crawling under hundreds of legal applications for refugees at risk of deportation. They're challenging executive orders daily. They are arrested, surveilled. Smear campaigns are created to discredit them. And I have already spoken to you about the laws created to constrain their work. Civil society, grassroots movements are resisting, but cannot fight this battle alone. These times demand the involvement of each one of us. We are being thrust into a ruleless world dreamed of by a select few who were bold enough to see their vision through. Our civic duty is thus to dream and bring another vision to life. If the wild, gluttonous dreams of a few men who aspire to own the world, to turn Gaza into a Riviera lined with golf courses, and to relocate to Mars while our planet suffocates from fossil fuels, if these visions can reshape our world, surely another way can also be dreamed into being. If anything, the surge of populism shows us that any idea, given the will and the energy to thrive, can come to fruition. We are trapped in a collusion of dreams, those of Mary MacLeod and the 1948 aspirations, and those of a few billionaires with the bold ambition to own and rule the world. And so we must dream our way out. I do worry sometimes that those of us who do understand this conceptually turn away from the audacity of imagination, perhaps because it appears impractical in the face of all these assaults. Instead, we get caught in reactive mode or analysis paralysis, often staring at the beast, discussing its attributes and pointing to its flaws. And yet, to advance human rights in a shifting, multipolar, and so far valueless world requires us to leave the cacophony of the present for a moment, to leap forward and redefine the world we want. It requires us to be connected to people, to their needs, and to make a vision as attractive as possible to those around us. How? There are examples of societies who have pushed back recently on the democratic backsliding, but this requires being alert and proactive, because by the time elections arrive, it is often too late to turn the tide. Senegal is a great example of this. Before their president attempted to run for a third term, they fought back and they mobilized, from civil society to academics to youth to trade unions. All of society was involved in pushing back against this rise of autocracy. You cannot win at a game you do not understand. And so we must equip people, especially people here at home, into understanding what authoritarian practices, the authoritarian playbook looks like. We must build international solidarity, share experiences, and resist the idea that we, or Canada, are immune to these as well. I would say, actually, that a lot of these narratives have already seeped into our national consciousness and are already shaping our politics. Liberal democracies have produced some of the foremost institutions of knowledge, but they have also been disconnected from the people and the society they aim to serve. And so extreme right movements excel in the division of labor amongst themselves. Those of us, I believe we are the overwhelming majority, who believe that every human being is born equal in dignity and in rights, must now build an ecosystem for humanity. And so if there are laboratories of state capture, then there must be laboratories for humanity, and we must invest in them. Communities of scholars, practitioners, students, activists, and strategists who exchange strategies, who follow the money trail, and who work in coalitions. That has been a key factor, especially in countries where civic space has been restrained, to push back on attacks. Secondly, we must walk the talk. There's no other way around it. As long as democracies fail to deliver on the basic needs of all its peoples, autocracy will always have a ripe audience. And liberal democracies are weaker today precisely because of their own contradictions and the sense that democracy perhaps has not delivered on the promise of dignity, humanity, and equality for all, but rather built a hierarchy of rights and a hierarchy of who should enjoy those rights. When you fail to uphold the values to the world, you encourage others to do the same. And when you fail to uphold them at home, you lose the trust of your constituents, who instead turn to the promises and narratives of anti-right movements to appease their concerns. History has taught us time and time again that no one is safe when human rights are under attack. Which brings me to current affairs in Canada. So far, and judging by the latest budget, Canada's proposed response to these challenges reflect an old world order. More arms, more big industries, more fossil fuels, more weapons at the border. A big muscle vision of the world, critiqued by feminist scholars for so long. The idea that any state, much less a state with a population as diverse as that of Canada, can protect itself from the instability of the world by investing in its defense, infrastructure, economy, and industries alone is not only a mirage, it is a threat to current and future generations. Today, international security is the oxygen mask for national security. And international security cannot be achieved without food, shelter, healthcare, the freedom to express your opinions, a free and independent press, and the independence of the judiciary, among others. Without these, conflicts will continue to escalate, impunity will embolden perpetrators, and power will be left unchecked. Only the most murderous, the ones with the most capacious drive to harm, survive. And so no amount of sophisticated weapons can shield Canada and Canadians in an unruly survival for the fittest world. We have tried that before. How far did it get us? Collective wisdom tells us that giving the most vulnerable among us a chance to thrive, to protect both freedom and equality, is how we build a safer world. Or, as best articulated by James Baldwin, we are yet to understand that if I am starving, you are in danger. There is a huge vacuum on the world stage today of states who can take these ideals seriously. A handful have started to come forward on very specific issues, perhaps most poetically at the International Court of Justice. For instance, South Africa's leadership at the ICJ on the genocide in Palestine drew over 1 million views online, a phenomenon never experienced before, but which speaks to the hunger people have for a higher body to oversee global justice. Or the Gambia, a tiny country taking on the side of the oppressed in Myanmar. Or Ireland and Spain again on Palestine. Much of the world still looks at Canada as a bastion of hope. It's an ambition we ought to take more seriously. Beyond the legitimate urge to elbow up, Canada could and should hold the flag of justice and human rights high in a ruleless world. History, after all, will judge us not just by how well we protected Canadian interests, but also how well we walked the talk and how hard we worked to safeguard a just and fair world for all. Lastly, to re-engage people, we must offer a hopeful future. Autocrats and populists are deliriously hopeful. None of them has ever sat down and thought, oh my goodness, these democratic institutions are far too complex to navigate. Human rights are overwhelming. It is too much. No, they have the nerve to pursue their vision to its end. And if we, as a global community, want to turn the tide, we must dream and act twice as boldly with practical audacity. Populists are capturing our civic imagination, and this is the battleground which cannot be ceded. And so those of us who believe in the inherent dignity of every life must transform ourselves. It's no longer enough to condemn, to litigate, to advocate. We must make people see and feel what a world where human rights are enjoyed by all feels like. This is what has always propelled humanity forward. From the dream of 1948 to the vision of Harriet Tubman, who dared to see beyond slavery and imagine a world and pursue it, a world of freedom, and pursue it against all odds. The recent victory of Zoran Mamdani, a perfectly unknown candidate just a year ago as the mayor of New York City, is a testament to how much people are ready to be engaged if they can see themselves in the future. So human rights believers must reconnect with people. All these tools are essential and useful, and each begins with an action, the courage to take a risk and to act upon one's ethos. It is the oldest trick in the book. Courage is what fueled the tireless advocacy of Mary McLeod Bethune in 1945. It is what fueled the protesters in Tiananmen and Tahrir squares, or the Gen Z protesters against tax increases in Kenya, despite arbitrary arrest and torture. Eventually, the president withdrew the proposed bill. This is the same courage that has always, always moved us forward. It was in the feet of Harriet Tubman as she imagined a life beyond slavery and brought others with her. If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If there's shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. Yes, my friends, the dogs, the torches, the shouting are at our feet. There is no doubt about it. But we must keep going. And no one exemplified this courage better than the students who protested across North America last year, risking their future jobs, arrests, expulsion, a reminder that democracy and human rights are not obsolete values, but breeding urgent and embodied demands. I was particularly moved and struck by the courage of a young class select of the 2024 Harvard Kennedy School. He and many others protested the decision to ban 13 of his classmates from graduation because of their campus activism on Gaza. In his remarkably courageous commencement speech, he quoted African-American scholar Rua Benjamin, whose work centers on imagination and justice. But it is his own words that I would like to leave you with tonight. As we leave this place, we will be told that casualties are inevitable, that we cannot solve all the world's ills, that there are impenetrable barriers to our dreams. But do not let that deter you. Center the hope that brought you here in the first place, and work with the conviction that tomorrow's world is ours to build. And we will do so unapologetically, with unfettered optimism, and hand in hand with one another. Thank you.
That was such an eloquent, inspiring rumination on the long sweep of human rights since 1945. It's very hard. I usually know where to begin, but this one is difficult. One of the most striking things about your talk was how you told the history of the beginning of human rights and what we call the liberal international order. And it was very striking to me. It's one that I know because I work on politics of the global south and the post-colonial tradition. But I find in the West, certainly in Canada and other places, that a lot of the voices that you privileged, which were central to that history, to radicalize the idea of rights, in the creation of the UN, and the anti-colonial movements, and then the decolonization that happened in Asia and Africa in the 50s and 60s, that these are not as well known. So that was really striking. And I was wondering, to put it in form of a question. So you talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as embodying two important traditions, which have often been in tension, if not rivalry: civil, political rights, social and economic rights, very much captured by Cold War politics. So when you say that we've never lived up to the spirit of that hope, are you saying that paradigm, that way of thinking about rights and seeing how they're connected to each other, is what we have to live up to? In other words, that paradigm, that vision is still absolutely adequate, but what happened is, for political and historical reasons, we failed to realize it? Or is it the case that the fact that we failed to realize that vision, whether it was post-colonial states that became very repressive, whether it was the case that Western democracies that were fighting the Soviet Union were also propping up all kinds of dictatorships in the global south and very selective in their championing of human rights. Does that history, that real history of gains and advances, but also many setbacks, tell us that we have to, as you ended saying, we have to dream again? I guess, if I put in other words, do we recover that moment of 1948 to live up to it? Or is it the case that history and some of the failures of that history, certainly during the Cold War, but even since, tell us that we have to think anew about, not to rethink what rights are, but to think what was it about the intellectual, the institutional architecture that we created that found that it was wanting to kind of make that vision real, fully real?
I don't think it's an either-or. I think we can do both. Mm-hmm. The challenge, when I completely agree that we do need to think anew, that clearly there are new tools for this new world that we need. The trouble when you discard that history and things like the International Criminal Court, for instance, and are fairly recent, right? Only created in 2002. The trouble when you discard those is then we're left with a world that has no rules at all. And the 30 human rights articles and that framework, however incomplete, has shielded us so much. It has enabled women to have the same rights as men, for instance. It has enabled so much of what we're able to do today. And so discarding that history would put us into a situation where we would have to fight for all of those again. And so I think we need to do both. We need to live up to that dream, recover the spirit of it, and live up to those aspirations, because we never fully did, while at the same time being able to give a picture, to imagine what a different world looks like. And this is what populists are excellent at. Very good at making you project yourself in this new world where you will have the income that you need, where you will have the job, you will have the resources, you will have the security that you need. Very good at that. And that's part of where I was ended. We need to go back to provide a real, tangible vision. Human rights alone are not, as someone says, I cannot eat human rights. I do not see what human rights mean. And yet, when you talk to those people who are, often in the most vulnerable situations, what they need are those, the basic needs of their rights. They're needing a roof over their head, right? Needing healthcare, needing access to, or freedom from being imprisoned just for holding a different opinion. So it's upon us, I believe, to really make those rights real and to create that picture really vividly, so that we come out of this sense of paralysis and despair, which is precisely what populists and autocrats want us to be, is to feel defeated, to feel as though this is too much, and I just want to be under my duvet and cover myself and only watch my series and stay on my phone and not watch what's happening elsewhere, because it is overwhelming. And that's precisely the goal, is to really isolate us and rob us of our ability to imagine a different future.
How should we think about, another fundamental tension is between sovereignty, national sovereignty, which was principle and such an important concept and norm and commitment in the post-45 era, because it didn't legitimize anti-colonial movements, because the imperial rule and the colonization of so much of the world was illegitimate. But that principle gave it a moral foundation and a legal foundation for those movements to come about. So you have sovereignty, which is so important. It is the watchword today again. Even in advanced industrialized democracies like Canada, we feel our sovereignty is under threat. And human rights, right? So you have sovereignty is the right of the state to have the final decision and so on. And then we have human rights. And that tension we saw play out in what we used to call the Third World, the Global South, in the long Cold War and since. There are times when there are trade-offs. There are situations where human rights activists will criticize what's happening within states, and some of those states will say, but these are our sovereign matters. Particularly if we ourselves have had a history of imperial subjugation and so on. How do you, and you are from Burundi, you were a rights activist there, how did you in your own work and thinking grapple with that tension between political sovereignty, popular sovereignty of a people, which is sort of a collective right, and human rights, which are individual?
So political sovereignty does not negate the reality that every human being across countries, across borders, is entitled to basic dignity. And the idea that these matters are simply within the realm of national sovereignty and should not be don't come into my kitchen, don't get involved into my house, don't tell me how to run my house, is a very convenient. I hear what you're saying, particularly when it's coming from formerly colonized countries, and of course with the imperial impulse that has existed and what it has done. I hear that, but it is often an excuse for states to not abide by those rights, because if you are treating your people equally and well, you have no issue with anyone coming in or making any comments. If anything, you'd be proud. You'd be able to say, look at how we've taken care of freedom of the press in our country. You'd be boasting it, right? It is not something to hide and be ashamed of. And so often I find that the states who are bringing in that argument are using it as a bit of a smokescreen to be able to conduct their affairs without external scrutiny. And that we should be concerned about. It's a little bit like what domestic violence used to be, at least in my country. When I grew up, on the street that I lived on, there was a family, and we knew that the mother, the wife in our family, was regularly beaten up by her husband. At night, we would hear her shouts and her screams. So the entire street knew what was happening. But the culture at the time was such that you cannot go into that house and rescue that woman. Only every once in a while that woman would run away and would come to our house. My mother was a single woman, and so she felt safer, and so she would come to our house and rest for a little bit and then go back. But for a very long time, nobody could get into that house. And yet we all knew what was happening. And the excuse was, this is my home. These are the affairs of my personal purview. And until a law came forward, and to this day it still hasn't changed, but until laws came forward and it became illegal, made to treat your wife that way, to be, to beat your wife, or domestic violence became punishable, nothing could have been done. You couldn't call the police. The police would not care. The police would not intervene. It was a private matter. And this is what states are trying to tell us. You cannot get involved into what's happening in my country because of national sovereignty. No. No.
So then, I hear you, and it's very powerful. I mean, example that you gave from private life, and then it's seen as a metaphor for what states do. Then how do you, at the same time you were saying in your talk, and we know this, that many more powerful states can be very selective about which human rights they protect, when they protect them, which states they protect. They protect their allies, are very critical of their perceived enemies or their real enemies, and so on. So how do you as a human rights activist who works for an organization like Amnesty, I mean, I was very struck in the reports that it's always a case that it's very impartial. You hold every government to account according to these principles, which are universal, but in your own advocacy work, how do you challenge governments to not be so selective, not to be morally hypocritical, that they will call out abuses in country X, but not really hold those in country Y to account?
It's challenging. I'll tell you that much. It's challenging, but the argument that makes sense to them, and to those who at least have an interest, a bit of an interest in these matters, is that by them not upholding to the rules, by them not playing by the rules, they're encouraging others to do the same. And so the understanding that the rules can only work if we use them and if we play by them. And if you choose to only condemn certain atrocities and not others, then you have no right to condemn another state that does the same.
Right.
So the principle of we must all play by these rules that have been set in place following the horrors, as I mentioned earlier, of what some of the most catastrophic moments of our times. And perhaps we've forgotten what we are capable of as human beings. You know, we've forgotten the atrocities that we're capable of if there are no rules at all. And so it is really pushing on those states to understand that it's not just them that are at stake and their allyship. It's our collective harmony and balance as a people that is at stake. When that doesn't work, it falls upon citizens. It falls upon each one of us to get your elected official to talk, to push. We elect these people. We choose who represents us. And our voices matter. And so then it becomes up to us, and that responsibility is borne by us, especially those of us in powerful states, to say, hey, here are the rules you said you would abide by. You must. We demand, we as a people of this nation, demand that you abide by these values. These are the values that define us as Canadians. And we demand that you move forward and not leave that only to the decision-making of politicians, which sometimes we can do, right? Because we're caught up in our daily lives. So it requires really being engaged, involved, and the very fact that there's a full room tonight, again, for me, is extremely reassuring. It means that we do care, and we are watching for what's happening, and we're ready, and we want to be engaged. But again, the power always rests with us. Certainly in democracies, the power rests with us, and it is immense. We must use our power.